Daina Ramey Berry is an associate professor of history and African diaspora studies and the Oliver H. Radkey Regents Fellow in history at the University of Texas at Austin. Before joining the faculty at UT Austin, she taught at Michigan State and Arizona State universities. She completed her BA, MA, and PhD in history, African American studies, and U.S. history at UCLA. Dr. Berry is a specialist in the history of gender and slavery in the United States with a particular emphasis on the social and economic history of the 19th century. In her first book, Swing the Sickle for the Harvest is Right, Gender and Slavery in Antebellum, Georgia, she examined slave labor, family, and community in two distinct regions. She is editor-in-chief of Enslaved Women in America, an encyclopedia, which was awarded one of the 2013 Outstanding Reference Sources by the American Library Association. In 2014, Professor Berry published Slavery and Freedom in Savannah, and this study of urban slavery in the Deep South had an accompanying exhibit with under the same name, hosted by Telfair Museums, sponsored in part by a major grant from the Institute for Museums and Library Services. The book and exhibit received awards from the American Association for State and Local History and the Georgia Archives. Berry and her co-editor, Leslie Harris, have a second edited volume tentatively titled Sexuality and Slavery, Reclaiming Intimate Histories in the Americas, currently under review. In addition to her scholarly writing and editing, Dr. Berry has appeared on several syndicated radio and television shows, including NPR, NBC, PBS, C-SPAN, and the History Channel. In 2010, she was on the season finale of Who Do You Think You Are?, where she reconstructed the genealogy of director, actor, and producer Spike Lee. In 2013, she appeared with Henry Louis Gates Jr. of Harvard University on episode 2 of The African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross. She is an advocate for public history and served as one of the technical advisors for the remake of the Roots miniseries, which aired in the summer of 2016. Her research has been supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council for Learned Societies, the American Association of University Women, the Ford Foundation, and the College of Physicians of Philadelphia. She is also a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians. We are so thrilled to have her here tonight, and she is here to talk about her second book that she's authored, her single-authored book called The Price for Their Pound of Flesh, The Value of the Enslaved from the Womb to the Grave in the Building of a Nation. Let's give Dr. Berry a nice, warm Lone Star welcome.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Good evening, everyone. You guys doing okay tonight? Yeah. Thank you for coming out. I appreciate it. I want to talk a little bit about my research and about the writing process and about this study that I've done that John just mentioned, was called The Price for Their Pound of Flesh. This is a project that I worked on for 10 years. I spent many years in the archives, and I'll tell you some archive stories, because I'm not sure if any of you have gone. Has anyone gone to archives and looked at primary documents? Show of hands. A couple people, all right. So I'll talk a little bit about that and what does it mean to take a document and write a story and to tell a story and to tell a history of a group of people. And I want to start off by just giving you sort of an overview of the book and how I came to make this study where it is. This is a copy of the cover up close for those of you who have not seen it. A lot of people, when they see the cover, they don't notice that there's a little child that's being sold and there's money on the table. And a lot of what I write about is heart-wrenching, but I'm hoping to share some stories of hope and of passion and of strength and of love that I found in these stories of the enslaved. So I'm going to start off with a little girl, a story of a little infant named Rachel. In 1854, Rachel, an infant girl, was placed on the auction block. Although she was wrapped in a coverlet and she was asleep, her face was exposed. An enslaved man had delivered her to the auction on the instructions of his enslaver. Rachel was about 1 year old and she was for sale. As the enslaved man sat on the courthouse steps with Rachel, waiting for the noon hour, which was the time and place for sales, many public auctions were held there, one wonders how he felt. Was it excruciating for him to carry out his enslaver's demand and bring little Rachel to the market? Or was he unmoved? What kind of exchange did he have with her parents? Did he feel partially responsible for what was about to take place? Imagine trying to keep the baby calm after she was separated from her mother, and then handing her over to a sheriff at the start of the sale. While the enslaved man sat there holding Rachel in his arms, the Reverend Nehemiah Adams, a visitor from Boston on a 3-month tour of the South, came over and approached him to ask a few questions. Adams was startled to see an enslaved man holding an infant, so he asked these questions. "Is the child sick?" Adams asked. Responding with deference, the enslaved man replied, "No, master, she's going to be sold." Puzzled, Adams inquired about the child's mother, to which the man answered that she was quote-unquote at home. The minister's mind was filled with all kinds of questions, but most importantly, he worried about Rachel's mother. How did she feel? How much did she miss her child? Was the infant taken openly or in private? Who did this? By now, Rachel was weeping and refusing to be comforted. This was too much for Adams, who chose not to stay and witness the sale that day. Later, he learned that Rachel had been sold for $140. Imagine her confusion as she looked at the group of potential buyers gazing at her, evaluating her earning potential. How did Rachel even begin to process what occurred? Her inconsolable crying is one clue, but she was too young to express her feelings in any other way. And I open up with the story of Rachel because when I first started doing the research for this book, I wanted to write a study that put a context around the numbers. Whenever we read histories of slavery, they'll sometimes sprinkle in, this person was worth $700, this person was worth $500. But no one ever said what that meant. Were those high prices? Were they low prices? Who set those values? And I always wondered, what did enslaved people think of this? Did they know how they were priced? Did they care? Did they have any thoughts about this? Did they respond? Did they react? What do these numbers mean? And so I actually initially set out to write a book about the value of the enslaved. And as I was doing that research, I created a database, and I just created it on an Excel table. And I had these columns, and every time I found sale records or bills of sales or any place where I found numbers where enslaved people were given values, I would put it in this table. And I had a column for the name, the age, the sex, and any other physical characteristics that I found in the records. And I had a column for ages, right? And I had age and years. And as I was going through the archives, looking at census records, bills of sales, broadsides, small slips of paper between one slaveholder and another, selling an enslaved person, I started finding that there was someone that was 8 months old. So I said, okay, I need to create a column for months. So I had age and years, age and months. And then I was doing some more research at an archive another day, and I came across someone that was 6 weeks old. And I remember I was like, wow, they actually sold them at this age. And for so long, while I was a graduate student and in my early career, most people said that parents weren't separated from their children, right? And this has a lot of relevance to things that are happening today, right? But they said parents weren't separated from children. And I kept seeing 6 weeks old, 5 weeks old, 4 weeks old. And then I actually had to take a break one time when I found a 3-day-old baby in the auction without their parents. And I had to add a column for days old. And that just kind of made me put everything on pause for a minute. So I decided to structure the book around the life cycle of a person from birth to death. So looking at infancy, which is why I started off with Rachel, to show that these are people that were put in the auction and they were put up for sale at very young ages. And what I wanted to learn was, not only did I want to know what these values meant, but I wanted to know, what did the enslaved think? What did they feel? How did they respond and react? And when did they start to recognize themselves as a person, which they knew they were, but when did they recognize themselves as a tradable good, as a commodity? How did they understand and how did they process that for themselves? And I found that right around age 5 or 6 was when they started to recognize, because their parents taught them. And I want to share a story of a young boy named Jourden. Many a man 50 years old had not seen or felt what I had before my 20th year. These are the words of Jourden H. Banks, who was born into slavery, sold 3 times, escaped twice, and ultimately reached freedom. His early years were pleasant compared to those as he matured into adulthood. In his narrative, which was published in 1861, we learn many things about the value of the enslaved and the ways that enslavers, traders, and medical doctors trafficked human chattel from birth to death and beyond. Now, Banks lived on a Virginia plantation with his parents and 16 siblings, which is a lot of family. And also, it's rare that you have these large families living together because the average enslaved person was traded or separated about 4 to 5 times in their lifetime. So even if you were born into one household and family, you would probably have 3 or 4, 5 or 6 times that you're sold out away from your family. And so one of the things that we found, and we've learned this in the 1970s, a lot of the scholarship in the 70s on slavery taught us that enslaved people came into families, and even if they were separated and traded, they would then try to regroup and find a new family. So we call this fictive kin, or you have play relatives, right? You have people that you call aunts and uncles and cousins that are not really related to you by blood, right? Well, enslaved people did that as well as a way to adapt and to survive. So, but Banks is coming from a family where he's with his family that's intact. He's with his 16 siblings, which is a really big deal. And as a young child, Jourden played with his enslaver son named Alexander, who was just about a year older than he. By age 5, though, Banks realized that he and Alex were different when his playmate began beating him. Banks fought back because his father warned him that he had to respond or else suffer from continued beatings. Embracing this spirit, Banks kept track of how many whippings he owed Alex, and he returned them blow for blow. Even in childhood, Banks's actions showed a nascent understanding of what I call his soul value, which was separate from his enslavers. As he processed the distinctions between himself and his nemesis, Banks experienced another epiphany. Alex attended school while he was sent to, quote, scare crows in the fields. And in his words, the dreary days of boyhood began in the fields. Now, this is a moment during enslaved childhood that served as a turning point in Banks's understanding of the reality of his condition. So this is where, like, around age 5 or 6 that they start recognizing things. Historian Wilma King recalls that this was called the quantum leap into the world of work. And as they aged, enslaved youth and young adults learned and intimately understood their place in the world. Banks's maturation solidified his understanding of enslavement, especially during 3 pivotal events of his early childhood and adulthood. The first was the sale of his 2 sisters. The second was the nearly fatal beating of his mother. And the third was the slow death of his enslaver. And of the latter, Banks remarked, "I saw him in life, and I saw him in death, but he left me in chains." So this is showing that as they age, they start to recognize, they start to understand themselves as a commodity. They start to understand that people are treating them like commodities. But sometimes enslaved people, as I was asking these questions about value, I kept bumping up into this notion of what they thought value meant. Not just about monetary value. People always ask me when I talk about this book, well, did they have bragging rights? You know, were they happy to be worth a certain dollar amount? Did they want to have a high price? And a lot of them could care less about their values. Like overall, a lot of them could care less. They just wanted to either remain with certain relatives or not go live with a particular enslaver. So that really varied based on where they were living and at the time. And so some of them were happy when they couldn't be sold. They were happy when their values were not negotiated properly because they may not have wanted to be sold. Many enslaved children, such as have vivid memories of their sale experience. Marlida Plethy of Missouri recalled that when she was 9 or 10 years old, she was put up on the block to be sold. Of the stand, she recalled, it was just a piece of cutout log, and it stood on one end. Her recollection, though, about her price is even more telling. They was offered $600, but my mistress cried so much that master did not sell me. The mistress's attachment to her human property was so great in this case that the family decided not to sell Marlida. Such interventions were not always successful, nor were they helpful. Several enslaved people reported that their mistresses were just as violent and sadistic as their husbands. In this case, we do not know if Marlida preferred to remain with her mistress and master, but all we know is that the value that she carried at that auction was greater than the price that the family was offered. And this made a very deep impression on her young mind. So this is saying, like, now she's around 9 or 10. Parents taught their children that you are a tradable good, and you have to function in the world with that understanding and know that that's what happens. And really the key age outside of age 5 or 6 is really when they went through their pubescent years, right? Because there's a difference. What do you think can you think of like why that matters during slavery? Why does it matter when a woman, a young slave girl is now able to give birth, right? Her value is going to increase. Why do you think her value would increase? Yes, in the back. Exactly. Additional sources of labor without having to purchase them. So the value of a female's body, one of the things that I thought when I first started doing this work was I actually thought that women during their childbearing years would have a higher value than all other enslaved people, because obviously they're going to be able to bring forth additional labors, assuming that they can give birth, right? And so I had found some plantations in Georgia from my first book that I've been doing research on, Swing the Sickle, and I found these plantations where I found women that were priced higher during these childbearing years. And I thought, okay, this makes sense. Now let me find out, is this a national trend? And I went and collected this database. The database that I used here in this book had about, it was up to 80,000 individual slave prices. Part of it was donated from some scholars, Robert Fogel and Stanley Engerman. And the other part was research that I did in the archives where I collected about 10,000 of these individual names, ages, and prices. And in this database, I found that overall, across the board, enslaved men and boys were always priced higher than young girls and women. So then I thought, okay, well, what was unique about these plantations in Georgia? Like, why were they priced higher? And it turns out most of those, the three plantations that I had most of the records from, the husbands were away. They were either away having political office. They were either absentee owners. So these were plantations that were operated by women. And so I'm guessing, this is like, we don't know this for sure, but maybe they placed a higher value on them because they understood about pregnancy and childbirth. We don't know that, but we have a journal for one, Frances Kimball, who wrote about back and forth these conversations she had with enslaved women. And she always sort of felt torn because she understood that, wow, they're going back to the fields 3 weeks after giving birth. This is so she had some empathy there, and she struggled. She struggled with what to do. So I think that perhaps those plantations that I had in Georgia that had women priced higher were more outliers than anything, and maybe that the fact that they were outliers came from the fact that there were women managers on those particular estates. Don't know that for certain, but that's what I suspect. So the pubescent years were terrifying. Not only were their bodies changing, but this was also a time when enslaved children experienced a separation that they had feared all their lives. Daughters and sons were taken from their parents as the external value of their bodies increased. Market scenes from their childhood now made sense and haunted them for the rest of their lives. At this stage in their maturation, they knew full well that others claimed ownership over their bodies. And they also knew that sexual assault came at any age. Some of them had experienced it by this time. However, their parents, if present, as well as other kin, reminded them of a value that enslavers and traders could not commodify. The spiritual value of their immortal selves, soul values, is my term for such valuations. Soul values often escaped calculation and developed during these years. Enriched through an inner spiritual centering that facilitated survival, soul values were reinforced by loved ones. Sometimes this internal value appeared as a spirit, a voice, a vision, a premonition, a whisper, a sermon, an ancestor, or a god. It came in public and private settings and was occasionally described as a personal message from a higher being, a heaviness in the core of their bodies. My soul began singing, one enslaved person recalled, and I was told that I was one of the elected children. This telling, this uplifting, this singing of a fearful thrill, of things unknown yet longed for still, made the enslaved feel free during captivity. Freedom of the soul matured in puberty. Soul values, which came from deep within a person's heart, were often felt in childhood, but yet not fully articulated until their early teens. recreating the social and economic circumstances under which enslaved people suffered allows us to make educated conclusions regarding the enslaved adolescents' internalized slave values. Unlike the appraisal or the sale values, these yearnings come from within and outsiders could not bargain for them. Such valuation shaped and defined enslaved people's characters. From the time that I was a little boy, Edward Walker recalled, it always ground my feelings to know that I had to work for another man. These feelings were not, quote, encouraged by my parents or other slaves. Instead, they came from within me and grew with me in the years. As he aged, Walker had the fortunate opportunity to learn to read and write, and he developed a big taste for arithmetic, according to some. He could add up numbers like a flash and could multiply and divide quickly and correctly and was good at fractions. These skills, his inherent yearning, and his belief of an incalculable soul value led Walker to a successful escape years later. Enslaved people often express their soul values by running away. Now, I want to just pause here for a minute because soul values is a term that I've created when I was looking at this. I found that there was something that kept them going. So many historians have written about enslaved people who were socially dead or struggling to survive. They were, and for obvious reasons, right? It was a very difficult time. It was a difficult experience. The amount of trauma that they were witnessing on a daily basis was difficult for them to go through. And so a lot of people that write about this talk about how enslaved people were just in a melancholy state, sort of barely functioning, right? But I kept thinking to myself, well, what about the ones that were not in that state of mind? What about the ones that survived? How do we have in 1865, 4 million African Americans granted their freedom, right? How did those 4 million people make it through the institution of slavery? And there had to be something that gave them the drive, for lack of a better word, to keep living. And I find that like soul values are expressed in so many different places, and running away is one place where I find them, where it's this value where they talk about how they can't commodify me. You may be able to commodify my body, but you cannot touch my soul. And so it's just over and over and over again. Frederick Douglass talks about it as a flame that's in the core of his stomach that flickers. It's like a light, it's like a match that goes out but then still has those red embers on the top, and if you blow it, it can come back on. Douglass talks about it in that way. He talks about how he was broken down to the point of almost death, right? For those of you that have read his narrative, he talks about that fight with Covey and how he was just made into this person where he almost didn't even recognize himself. And he was in a melancholy state for months on end. And then something deep inside of him sort of welled up, and he got the idea to fight back. And it was after that fight that he said, "You now will see a slave become a man." And that was the last fight he ever had. And from that moment forward, he sort of lived in that moment that I would call his soul value. I want to talk now about another part of my study, just a few more things here, and then I wanted to share with you a part that surprised me, that took me on a research journey that I was not expecting to go on. I was looking at how enslaved people go through their whole life cycle, right? And I was looking at aged slaves, what happens when people age. And one of the things that was shocking to me is that some of the elderly slaves, do you think they had values? Monetary values? Do you think their values were high or low? What do you think? Low, right? Well, why were they low? They couldn't do the same kind of work that they could before, right? But when we look at the value from the enslaved perspective, in the community, the elders had a lot of value, right? It was not the kind of value that was measured in monetary values. They were the gatekeepers of the culture. They knew about the community. They had the history of that plantation or that farm and that community. They understood and had all kind of survival strategies to share. So within the slave community, they were the most valuable people. But if you look on the record books that we have that survive, they were listed as zero value or no value, right? And so a lot of people talk about when they were at the end of their lives, they were just turned out. Like, when they reached a certain age and they couldn't sell them, they would just say, well, you can go live on the plantation, or you can go wherever you want. So it was like a lot of the people in the community took them in, right? Some elderly enslaved people were taken care of. I did find evidence of, here in Texas actually, of 2 former sort of group homes for former elderly enslaved people. that were in Texas, which I think it was just one little newspaper article, and I'm still trying to find more about this, but it shows that there are people out there that cared about the elderly, right? And they tried to find a way to give them a space to live and have some dignity towards the end of their lives. But as they aged, they really understood their value, not only the monetary value, but also their soul values. And one of the stories, one of my favorite persons in this book is a man by the name of Isaac, who was from South Carolina, and he was going to lead a rebellion. And he had plotted and had some people that would help him, and they were going to have an uprising to overthrow the system of slavery. And somehow it got found out. I always tell my students, I'm like, somebody snitched on him, right? Somebody told, and then they got found out, and the plot was ruined, and they weren't able to execute this rebellion, right? And so Isaac was taken to jail, and he was very well known in his community. He was taken to jail, and the minister who had baptized him, who had had a relationship with, came to speak to him. He said, okay, Isaac, we need to know who else was involved with this uprising. We need to find out all the other people that were involved. And he said, there's nobody. Just take me. I'm the one. I'm the one. Take me. And they said, well, no, we know there's other people. You know, and they took him to court. He still, when they asked him to speak, he said, I'll die a noble death if you just take me. I'm the one. I'm the man. Take me. And they kept saying that. They kept trying to put pressure on him. Well, that night, the two of them, his minister and Isaac, had about 3 or 4 hour conversation where they talked. And Isaac questioned him. He asked him questions about the Bible. He asked him questions about things that he had learned. And he said, to the minister, he said, I know that God is a God of the black and the white. He said, and that you're no better than me. He said, so why is it that I'm here, and why do I have to wear these chains, right? And so they go back and forth, and by the end of their conversation, the minister actually feels guilty. He feels like, this isn't right. Like he's struggling with this institution of slavery. And the next day, they prayed, and the two of them were holding hands, and they were crying, and the minister left and didn't get a confession out of him, right? Didn't get any other names. But he couldn't come to the execution. The minister didn't want to witness that because he had a lot of respect for Isaac. The next day, Isaac is there with 4 or 5 other gentlemen, including one of them was his brother. And they were standing at the gallows. They put the rope around his neck, and at that time, they would pull a string that would pull the floor from underneath them. And he was standing there, and they asked him, Isaac was going to go first, and they said, this is your last chance. Do you have anything to say? He said, just take me. And then he looked at the other men that were standing there with him. He said, be men and die like men. And he jumped before they could pull the string. He jumped, and he lifted up his feet, and he hung himself. And I thought that when I read that story, it was in a newspaper, it really had an impact on me. Because that to me was a perfect example of Isaac expressing his soul value. He wanted to determine how he was going to die. He wanted to determine when he would die, and he didn't want somebody else to take his life. So if I'm going to die a noble death. And the other men, when they had the noose put around their neck, they did the exact same thing. Before they could pull the string to lower the floor, they all took their own lives. And one of the things that's, you have to find beauty in this history because it's very difficult history. His wife and children were nearby, Isaac's, and they said that somebody waved at them once they buried his body near a lagoon. She went over there, and the kids put like some beautiful stones on a flesh flower, and they said that they had never seen this particular flower in that community, and every single day there was flesh flowers on that grave up until she passed away. So it shows that even after Isaac is gone, the family is still, burying the dead and thinking about them. And so Isaac, to me, is a really excellent example, although it's a tough example, but it's an excellent example of how enslaved people celebrated the end of their lives. And so when I got to the end of the book, and as I was getting to the end of my research, I thought, okay, now what do they look at death? And Elizabeth Keckley says, at the grave, at least we should be permitted to lay our burdens down to a new world. A world of brightness may open up to us. The light that is denied us here shall grow into a flood of effluence beyond the dark, mysterious shadows of death. And then one of Nat Turner's descendants, Lucy Turner, talked about the grave, and she says, sometimes there is a victory in the grave, which leads to a bright eternal heaven, where faith, hope, charity, love, and justice shall last forever and ever without ceasing. And so I literally felt like this is the end of the book. This is where, I now have a sense of how they saw the end of their lives. They found hope in the afterlife. There was hope for them somewhere, right? And then I stumbled upon the valuation of enslaved people's bodies when they were hung, like when they died. And I kept thinking, like, why are they putting monetary values on their bodies when they're either hung by the state or when they're executed for committing a crime? And why am I finding records where they're giving the value right before they died? And then I started doing some more research, and I really started off with Nat Turner, who I write about in chapter 4, because Nat Turner, you guys have heard of Nat Turner? Some of you have. He led a major slave rebellion in 1831 in Virginia, in Southampton, Virginia. And it's probably the biggest slave rebellion in well, not the largest. The largest was in New Orleans in 1811, Charles Deslandes Rebellion. But Nat Turner led a very, very powerful rebellion in 1831. And when he died, I was looking at the court records because I was comparing him to Isaac just to try to understand Nat Turner's end of life. And I saw that they had decapitated him. And I was thinking, okay, I've been studying history. I've been writing about slavery for more than 20 years. Why is it that I never knew this? Why did I not know he was decapitated, and what happened to him? Like, where is he buried? Like, what did they do to his body? And something just got me on this mission that I was going to try to find, like, what happened to his body. So I started tracing what happened. There was a little note that said, the medical students were fighting over his body and over his skull. And I was like, what do they mean medical students were fighting over his body and his skull? And then I started doing research, and I went back and spent 3 more years looking at medical school archives all over the United States, in the North and the South. And I started tracing where Nat Turner's skull, I found all the medical schools that his skull was examined. I found lecture notes from classes where students said, we looked at the skull of the Negro named Nat Turner who led an unsuccessful revolt in Southampton, Virginia. Because they often would inscribe their names on cadavers and bodies when they just to mark that they were there. And so they were measuring his skull. This was like on the eve of racial science, before the eugenics movement. This is also before the American Medical Association was founded in the 1840s. So this was a period of great discovery, right? It might be sick from our perspective today for some people, but this was really a period where they were trying to learn and understand about the human body. And what I learned was that they took enslaved bodies, not just enslaved, but there was a whole underground market of cadavers being traded and sold to medical schools so that they could use the bodies for anatomical research. And I was blown away when I saw that. I was totally blown away, and I thought I have to know more. And everybody's like, well, haven't you working on this book long enough? And I thought, well, I gotta go deeper. And so I found Nat Turner's skull, and I followed the routes his skull traveled more than 365 miles, all the way up into Ohio and Indiana from Virginia. There were different medical schools and students that talked about seeing it. And I found it got me to this place in Gary, Indiana, where there was the former mayor of Gary, Indiana, Richard Hatchett, supposedly had his skull. He got it from some trader or some dealer. So I called him. I was like, I want to know what he did with this, and I want to know where it is. So I called him up, and he asked me a whole bunch of questions. Are you a descendant? Are you related? And I was like, no, I'm just a nerdy historian trying to find out what happened to Nat Turner's skull and find out, where it is and who has it and why. And he said, well, I can neither confirm nor deny having possession of it. And I hung up that phone, and I said to my husband, I said, he has it. He has to have it. Because neither confirm nor deny. If you didn't have it, you would say you didn't have it, right? So I thought he didn't. So about a year later, as I was finishing up the book, I got a phone call from National Geographic because they had heard about my research, and they actually had been given the skull from Richard Hatchett, and they did a short. If you go on to Nat Geo, you guys can Google this later, but National Geographic or National Geographic Explorer, look at Nat Turner, and you'll see the short video that they did where they actually show Hatchett. They have a video of him giving the skull over to the family, and right now they're doing DNA testing. And the producer said to me that they had a slip of paper in there that had sort of the travel route of where the skull was taken and all the different places. And I was like, okay, can I see that? Because I wanted to know, did I have any of the right sites? Like, was the research trail I had, did it match that? And what schools did I miss? And he couldn't show it to me, but I'm still like trying to be nice, and hopefully I'll be able to see it one day. But they do know that you know, the skull was traded through a number of places, and I came up to the same place that they found it at. And so for me, I thought, what do we do with this history? You know, what do we do with this, that bodies are, after death, being commodified? What does it mean that enslaved people die and then their cadavers are being sold to medical schools for anatomical research? Now, these weren't the only bodies in circulation. Poor whites, people that were in almshouses and prisons and so forth, were often also traded. But I was interested in the enslaved bodies because I'd never heard of that. So I started looking through and just trying to track in the medical school records, the dean's records, the intake records from hospitals, or the records where they were sending the bodies out. And I realized that there was a whole circulation. And so the last chapter of the book focuses on the domestic cadaver trade. And I describe it as a trade where bodies are being moved in and out. They're being moved in and out of a system that is highly organized, that I really believe that I just scratched the top of the surface of this. I did not cover the New York trade. There was a lot of bodies going as far north as Maine, all the way down into South Carolina, Georgia. And they were being traded in big, huge whiskey caskets or whiskey barrels to preserve, because they didn't have formaldehyde at that time. They weren't using that. They used brine and lime and other solutions. And these barrels were being traded on the same ships that enslaved people who were alive were being traded. So they thought that these barrels were storage facilities, right? I'm going to come back to Mingo at the end, but when I talked to you about Isaac, the cadaver trade, sometimes if they were taking them short distances, would put them in these body bags and then take them to the medical school and they would dissect them. And after looking at the medical notes, a lot of the students were saying, you know, when they cut open the bodies, they were surprised that the organs inside the black cadavers were the same as the organs inside the white cadavers. I think that's ironic that they actually thought that there was going to be a difference inside. Oh, they have kidneys, they have liver, there's a heart, you know. So there was all this sort of surprise. They were always very surprised by that. But the domestic cadaver trade was a fully functioning trade that we should look at and think about the same way we do the transatlantic slave trade, the domestic slave trade. It's another form of trade, but these are dead bodies. And I ended the book with that. And for me, it was difficult for a while because I didn't know, one, what to do with that. Like, what does it mean that they're still being sold, right? And I tried to think, well, how did enslaved people respond to that? And Mingo shared this poem that I wanted to end with before we open up for Q&A, to tell you what Mingo shared with his wife. Now, Mingo had ran away because his wife and he were sold. I mean, they were separated, and he was very upset about that. And when he was put in the jail, he was in there, and he spent about 8 or 9 months in the same jail, so he got to know other enslaved runaways. And he, one of the things that they always did was they tried not to tell people their real names. They didn't want to be captured. They didn't want to tell people about where they lived or the plantation they had been on. But one of the guys that was there was so weak and sick that when his enslaver got there, the guy wasn't going to make it back. He was not going to make it back alive to his plantation. But his enslaver came all the way to find him. And Mingo's watching this, and he's saying this guy became really close to a medical doctor. He starts telling them his name. They found out who his owner was. The owner came to claim the guy's body. And they were like, well, you know he's not going to make it back. And he says, I don't care. You know, I'm going to bring him back dead or alive. And Mingo says, which is where I got the title, he said they didn't care. All they wanted was the price for their pound of flesh. And so that's where I got the title from, but that's also from Shakespeare, Merchants of Venice as well. So Mingo is here in this prison after he sees this young comrade of his taken away. He's thinking about his wife and his children that were sold from him. And he says, this is the message that he's a poet. And he inscribes this on the beam of a prison wall. And this particular poem made it into a Boston newspaper years later. Good God, and I must leave them now, my wife and my children in their woe. 'Tis mockery to say that I'm sold, but I forget these chains so cold. Dear wife, they cannot sell the rose of love that in my bosom glows. Remember, as your tears may start, they cannot sell thy immortal part. Thank you very much.